The ancient Greeks were fascinated with the mysteries of nature. They tried to explain them all, from why there are stars in the sky to how man discovered fire. The early storytellers put a human face on these unsolved mysteries, making up bold and exciting adventures of bigger-than-life heroes, gods, goddesses, and monsters. Imagine if you were an ancient Greek thinker. How would you explain the mystery of the changing seasons, for instance? Remember that flower that Persephone picked just before Hades appeared to her? It's called a narcissus, and it just happens to be named after one of the main characters of our next myth. This myth also involves a creature called a nymph. Nymphs were magical creatures who protected natural things like the mountains, trees, and water. Nymphs were usually portrayed as young girls, and the one who fell in love with Narcissus has a name you may have heard before, Echo. The story of Echo and Narcissus is a kind of a love story, and a way of explaining another natural phenomenon, the repetitive sound of an echo. Echo was one of the many nymphs that lived in the forests of ancient Greece, and she had an extraordinary talent for talking. In other words, she could tell great stories, but she was a bit of a chatterbox.
Through the valleys and the hills, it's just marvelous. That reminds me of a story I was going to tell you about.
One day, Hera, queen of the gods, came down from Mount Olympus in search of her husband Zeus, the great king of the gods. Hera was in a hurry and was not what you would call a patient woman. Every time she tried to ask Echo if she had seen Zeus, the well-meaning but not very tactful Echo managed to interrupt her.
Nymph, have you seen...
It has been so long since you visited our woods, and we are honored to see you.
Yes, naturally. But what I want to know is...
Have you ever noticed how sweet the air is when the west wind passes over the fields of lavender?
Look, child, I want to know...
Lavender is my very favorite herb. I'm never feeling nervous or tense.
Unfortunately for Echo, Hera was not the kind of goddess who liked to stand around chatting with talkative nymphs.
And I also...
Words! You have far too many words for one little nymph. Nobody else can get a word in edgewise. Well, I'll fix that. From now on, you will only be able to repeat what has just been said to you. That will make you a better listener. Now leave me.
Echo tried to plead with Hera for forgiveness, but all she could say was,
Now leave me. Go.
Go.
Scram.
Scram.
Poor Echo wandered through the forest alone. Her life seemed all but over until one day she spotted a handsome boy named Narcissus, who was hunting in the woods. Instantly, she fell deeply in love. She wanted desperately to tell him so, but of course she couldn't say a single word until someone else spoke first. She would just have to wait for the right moment. What Echo didn't know was that many a girl before her had tried to attract the attention of the splendid Narcissus, but it seemed that no one could catch his eye. That is, until the day that he happened to see his own reflection in a pool of water. Of all the pretty faces he'd seen, Narcissus had never found one more fascinating than his own. Perfection. Utter perfection. You're fabulous. This was Echo's chance. From her hiding place behind a rock, she repeated the words that she so longed to say.
You're fabulous.
Narcissus grew more and more enchanted with his own image. He never once looked away from his reflection, for he was now sure it had spoken back to him.
I've never said this to anyone. I believe I love you.
I love you.
But as Narcissus reached into the water to try to touch the face that so fascinated him, it simply disappeared.
Don't leave me.
Dismayed at the sudden loss of his only love, Narcissus plunged into the deep pool. Echo rushed out from behind the rock.
but it was too late. All she could say were the words that she last heard.
Don't leave me.
Echo's grief was unbearable. She wandered through the mountains without eating or drinking. And slowly, she faded away until all that was left of her was her voice. According to the ancient Greeks, Echo's spirit still exists in all the mountains and caves of the world. And you can even hear her today, repeating the last words of anyone who calls out to her. Hello! As for Narcissus, he didn't disappear forever either. In fact, a very strange thing happened. On the very spot where he was last seen, a beautiful flower grew. And as it grew, it leaned over the pool, still trying to get a look at itself. The flower, of course, is called the Narcissus.
Many words that we use today have their roots in Greek mythology. A narcissist, for instance, is someone who is so involved with himself that he can't love anyone else. It was Echo's misfortune to fall in love with one. One of the great things about myths is that they get you to see the world with fresh eyes, and everything that you took for granted comes to life in a new way. Take the sun that comes up every day. The Greeks said it was the work of a god named Helios, and they told the story about Helios and his mortal son Phaethon, who couldn't wait to borrow the keys, so to speak, to his father's chariot.
The ancient Greeks believed that the passage of the sun across the sky was controlled by Helios, the sun god. According to the story, Helios rises from the east out of the ocean in a chariot pulled by 4 fire-breathing horses, which he drives across the sky, bringing light into the world. At noon, Helios rides high into the sky, providing the brightest light of the day. And as his journey ends, he descends over the western horizon, giving us sunset. Finally, he returns to his palace in the east and rests for the next day's journey. Most mortals didn't get to visit the great palace of the sun where Helios lived, but one boy named Phaethon was determined to go there. For he had been told that Helios was his father. Helios was very happy to see Phaethon and admired him for making the successful journey. In fact, he was so proud of his bold, brave son that he told Phaethon that he would give him anything he wanted.
Father, this is what I wish for. I want to carry the sun across the sky like you do, just one time.
Oh, as for anything else, but not that. It is far too dangerous. But Phaethon was determined, and because Helios had given his word, he could not take it back. So that morning it was Phaethon who mounted the chariot. Helios gave him all the pointers he could, and when the gates opened, Phaethon snapped the reins and the chariot took off. At first, everything went well. The chariot rose smoothly into the sky, carrying the sun behind it. Phaethon was flushed with a great feeling of power as the wind blew and sunlight streamed behind him, bringing light to the earth. But that was a lot of horsepower for a young, inexperienced man to handle. All at once, things began to go wrong. The horses were used to the powerful hand of the god Helios, and their pull was too strong for Phaethon, who struggled against the horses but could not command them. Suddenly, the chariot veered off course and began to plunge toward the earth. It burned the earth for many miles, creating deserts, forest fires, and volcanoes. As Phaethon struggled to get back on track, he pulled the horses up too sharply, and the chariot was carried too high now, leaving ice caps on the frigid earth below. Just then, the great Zeus hurled a mighty thunderbolt at the chariot, and it plunged down, down, down into a river. If not for Zeus's action, that fateful ride may well have destroyed the earth. Phaethon himself was lost, but most parts of the earth were saved. Helios grieved for his son, but he could not abandon his task. The very next day, Helios was back in charge of the sun, riding a new chariot along the same journey, east to west.
And that, say the ancient Greeks, is how those hot, sandy stretches of desert, those frosty, cold polar caps, and those rumbling volcanoes were formed. Blame it all on a young man named Phaethon who thought of himself as a better driver than he actually was. By the way, Helios learned his lesson and never lent his chariot to a mortal again. In fact, the only one he ever allowed to drive the sun chariot again was the great god Apollo. But that's another story. And that's the great thing about myths. There's always another story. It seems that there was no mystery of nature or human life that the ancient Greeks couldn't explain with a myth. And human life, after all, is what the myths are really